Ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our discussion on mobilizing the private sector in support of refugees and migrants, please welcome Vice President of the Open Society Foundations, Patrick Gaspard.
Good morning. Thank you, Nick and Matt, for the powerful example of your humble leadership and for the transformative partnerships with which you've engaged with the Open Society Foundation over the span of several years. Concordia has, of course, done terribly important work in a vital space, bringing together multi-sectoral leaders across a range of issues vital to the common good. In many ways, Concordia provides an architecture for the kindness of strangers. This partnered approach should be a first instinct in a world with growing and such evident interdependencies. Regrettably, a pronounced nativism in some of our politics is too richly rewarded and makes the Concordia philosophy all too rare. When Matt was on stage before, he talked about the need for radical inclusivity and how that's what's represented here by Concordia. I think that right now in our times, there's also a need for a radical empathy. Today, this multi-stakeholder vision is indispensable, as no single sector alone can solve the myriad challenges that we are faced with in this spinning globe, whether it's climate change, inequality, or the large-scale challenge of forced migration. We've seen this in heartbreaking ways with the refugee crisis of recent years, not only the ones in the Middle East and Africa, which has seized the attention through the media of citizens across the world, but also right now, today, in Asia, where the Rohingya in Myanmar are forced out of their homes by the hundreds of thousands, a brutal forced migration, as well as in Central America, where violence is compelling a lost generation of youth to flee elsewhere for safety. In the midst of these tragedies, our inspiration has come primarily from countless acts of compassion by individuals, civil society, faith-based communities, and by businesses of all kinds. They've reminded us that how we respond to this refugee crisis is not about principally who they are, but about who we are and the set of values by which we abide. Exactly 1 year ago today, on this stage, the founder of the Open Society's Foundation, George Soros, committed to investing up to $500 million in equity investments in companies addressing challenges related to migration and displacement, including one's own, started by migrants and refugees themselves. You'll hear great details about this work in a bit, but as you listen to the charts, the numbers, the sense of monetary and material impact, let's understand and appreciate that the epiphany for this work from George Soros comes from personal experience, the cauldron of biography, and his very clear sense that not to act and to remain in silence is actually an act of complicity. In the opening session of Concordia, you will also hear from our partners in the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. The initiative, which we also launched here last year, works to channel the compassion of individuals around the world into programs where communities take direct responsibility for welcoming and integrating these refugees. I'm delighted not only by the initiative's terrific progress and by the tireless commitment of our partners, but also by what we've learned in this process, how to align our interests, how to forge a common agenda, and how to leverage each other's strengths. It takes this kind of collaboration across sectors to confront the challenges related to migration, displacement, and integration. This common sense of mission is absolutely critical. It is essential, particularly at a time when our values are under assault. There is no time to rest. And as George Soros said here last year, in a nod to all of our mortality and the urgency of the moment, there is no time to spare. Thank you.
And now, please welcome the chair of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative and managing director of the University of Ottawa Refugee Hub, Dr. Jennifer Bond, and our distinguished panel.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see so many of you here with us this morning. My name is Jennifer Bond, and I'm the managing director of a NGO run out of the University of Ottawa, and also chair of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by four distinguished panelists: the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, the Honorable Ahmed Hussein, Canada's Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, the Managing Director of the Fiore Group of Companies and Director of the Radcliffe Foundation, Laura Dauphini, and Sean Hinton, CEO of Soros Economic Development Fund, Director of the Economic Advancement Program of the Open Society Foundations. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us. In my capacity as chair of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, I have the true privilege of working every day with teams from all four of the organizations that are represented on the stage this morning. And it has been truly a phenomenal experience for me to see firsthand the impact we can have when we bring together private, public, and community organizations around a common goal. And in particular, a common goal to try to solve a very big and very important problem. I'm looking very much to hearing from each of our panelists today on their perspectives on our collective project, the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, and on private sector engagement in the refugee sector more generally, particularly at this time of overwhelming need. Before launching into a series of questions, I hope you'll just permit me one brief moment to reflect on my own journey with the formation of this initiative. And as you just heard Patrick mention, last year on this exact day here at Concordia, we were gathered to launch the GRECE or the Jersey or the GRSI. We haven't yet agreed on our acronym, though we have done many other things together over the last few months. And I met many of the principals just down the hall from here, outside of an elevator, actually. We had begun talking by phone several weeks earlier when an official from the Government of Canada started to connect a number of us, saying he thought we might have some things to talk about. And those phone calls gave me a real glimpse of what this initiative would go on to become. I had a taste of the leadership and generosity of the Government of Canada in sharing its expertise, working collaboratively with many partners around the world, and truly investing in capacity building in other countries in a way that is important and I think unique. I got a taste of the bold and innovative approaches the UNHCR was committing to in its attempt to try to find creative ways to expand refugee protection and also to seek out new partnerships in its quest to do so. And I was exposed to the ongoing and relentlessly creative investment and strategic vision by the Open Society Foundations, who came to this project with a vision and a tremendous amount of energy to push that vision forward. All of these budding intentions culminated in an announcement here at Concordia last year, and the GRECE became real. A few weeks later, we were incredibly fortunate to be joined by Frank Giustra and Laura, who's with us today, and the Radcliffe Foundation, an invaluable addition to the partnership that brought not only critical resources, and we did need those to help us get started in those early days, but also an amazing strategic and entrepreneurial vision. I would suggest the very best of the private sector that really brought a new and important dimension to our work. In December, the GRECE was formally announced at meetings in Ottawa, and here we are, exactly 1 year from our announcement, 9 months since our launch, and many thousands of emails later. So I'm very excited to hear what my partners have to say about the project and about some of their other work in this space, but I want to begin by thanking them all for their leadership on this file. It's really a true pleasure for me to work with each of your teams every day. And I want to really thank you and your organizations for taking this journey with us in this important work. Now, High Commissioner, if I may, I'd like to begin with you. of course, the greasy announcement last year was on the margins of the UN summit. The core of the summit, the major announcement, was the New York Declaration and the associated commitment to develop a global compact on refugees. So at a time when the refugee system is being so incredibly challenged by historically high numbers and anti-immigrant sentiment, by a shortage of capacity and resettlement capacity around the world, I'd be interested in your thoughts on what role the compact can play in that environment and whether there's a role for the private sector as part of that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here exactly a year later. I was there the day of that very important announcement, and we've made a lot of progress, which I think we'll talk about. And I think it's good that you start by putting this initiative somehow in the context of the work that we're all doing towards the Global Compact on refugees, which we hope to have established by the General Assembly in a year's time. So we'll meet again and discuss that next year, which will be the crucial time. Now, what is the Global Compact? As you know, there are two Global Compacts that are being discussed, one on refugees, one on migrants. My organization, obviously, is responsible for facilitating the preparation of the Global Compact on refugees. The Global Compact is a reiteration of commitments by all states in the UN to the fundamental principles of refugee protection. But it is also, as I always say, a reaffirmation and perhaps a strengthening of the reaffirmation that refugees, as the Refugee Convention says very clearly in its preamble, are a global responsibility. Cannot be the responsibility only of a few donor countries or of a few host countries. It has to be shared widely. And the increasing numbers of refugees and displaced people of the last few years reinforce this argument that this is a global crisis that can only be responded globally. And globally means by all countries in different ways, but it also means that we need to promote increasingly in the responses that we provide to this crisis, we need to promote what we call a whole of society approach. So states have a primary responsibility in partnership with United Nations organizations like mine, like IOM and others, but so has civil society, so have local governments, so has academia, so has the private sector, which is really what we discuss here. The private sector, we have learned in the last few months, especially as we test the model proposed that we want to propose for the Global Compact, the private sector has enormous contributions to make. And I'm not just talking about money, which of course is important, but also in terms of proposing business models to respond to crises that bring innovative elements to what we have been doing traditionally for many years. And I could give you many examples of what we are already testing in many refugee crises around the world. My final point, by way of introduction, is to say that this initiative, the Global Refugee, the Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, one has to always remember these complex names. This initiative, I see it as very much part of this effort. The initiative has two key elements. One is that it is meant to increase the opportunities for resettlement. What is resettlement? Because not everybody always is clear about that. Resettlement means bringing people who are already refugees in poor countries or fragile countries where perhaps protection is not always as robust as we would like it to be. Bring those refugees, especially the most vulnerable, to situations where they are better protected in a variety of ways. So that's what resettlement is about. It is, by definition, a selective program. Less than 1% of the refugees worldwide are resettled. We estimate that the needs for resettlement should be more than 1.2 million a year. In reality, last year, for example, we had less than 200,000 people resettled. So this initiative can help multiply the opportunities, offer more resettlement space to people in need. And the second important element is that it promotes private sponsorships to resettlement. Other colleagues that are more involved directly will speak about that, but for us, this is important in the spirit of that whole of society approach that we are promoting around the Global Compact.
Great, thank you very much. That's a nice way to start. I think we have a very helpful framing of some of the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Minister, I'd like to turn to you now. We've heard the High Commissioner talk about private sponsorship and what sponsorship might mean in terms of a bigger resettlement program. Maybe you can help us understand a little bit more. What is Canada's private sponsorship of refugees model, which is at the heart of this collective work, and why is Canada so keen to share that model with others?
I'd like to first begin by acknowledging that I don't know where she is in the audience. My Shadow Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, the Honorable Michelle Rempel, is in the audience. I'd like to thank her for participating and joining me here and for the next few days. I actually feel much better about Canada. If 200,000 refugees were resettled across the world, we resettled 46,000 of those 200,000. So I'm actually more proud to be Canadian. I think that in addition to the Government of Canada's government resettled refugee program, the private sponsorship of refugees by Canadians has enabled the Government of Canada to resettle more refugees than they could through if we only talked about the government sponsorship program. And from the late 1970s, when the private sponsorship of refugees in Canada became a real program that became sustainable, through that program we've been able to resettle 288,000 refugees in Canada, just through the private sponsorship program. That means those 288,000 people would not have been resettled in Canada if we didn't have a private sponsorship program. So I think it's a great program that adds to what Canada is already doing. But second, and more importantly to me and to the Government of Canada, the private sponsorship of refugee program is less expensive for the government because ordinary Canadians bear some of the costs of resettlement. And secondly, the integration outcomes tend to be much, much better and faster because there's really an embedding of that refugee or the refugee family in the community. And so you end up having people who really rally around that family. And those people are transformed equally, if not even more transformed than the refugee family themselves. And they turn around and become some of the most positive advocates for refugee resettlement after that experience. And I can tell you, as Canada is more and more exporting that model around the world, one of the videos that Jennifer's group made me take part in was a video that compared the private sponsorship of refugees in Canada and now a new program that is taking place in UK, which is modeled after the government program. And when you watch the hosts in Wales and in Eastern Canada, in this particular example, you had the refugees and the hosts being interviewed in both programs. And speaking about the transformation of the host communities, you had grandmothers in Canada and grandmothers in the UK speak about how they suddenly had new grandchildren and new families that they didn't expect to have in their lifetimes, and how fortunate they felt to have this group of people who joined their community and made their school system better and just made them feel that they were able to do a small thing in a bigger crisis that initially made them feel that they couldn't do anything. And when you watch that video and you looked at the two hosts in the two countries for the two refugee families, apart from the accents, the feelings were the same. They both felt really positive about the experience. And so the private sponsorship of refugee program is something that I think was unique to Canada, but now we're being approached by more and more countries to help them. Because countries like this program, as I said, it's cheaper for the government, it has better integration outcomes. The refugees who go through the private sponsorship of refugee program find jobs faster than the others. They learn English or French faster. And so we're finding that it's becoming a really good Canadian export. And we're helping other countries and engaging directly with private sector and civil society to enable them to build the capacity to be able to do private sponsorship of refugees around the world. So now the UK has a private sponsorship of refugee program. I was there when the government launched and put some real money behind it. 3 South American countries, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil are interested. They've been coming to Canada to learn from the Canadians. The New Zealanders and the Australians have also expressed interest. We think Argentina is the closest one to actually move on this. And we've developed guidelines that could be used by any NGO or a group of people across the world, and those guidelines are published in English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And they're really a how-to-do guide on private sponsorship of refugees. So that's one way in which Canada feels that we can contribute. The Canadian model cannot be cut and pasted onto each and every country in the exact same way, but we think that the benefits that we've had from private sponsorship of refugees could be an example and a lesson that could be applied somewhat to different refugee environments in other countries.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a moment just to direct anyone who's interested in the guidebook that the minister mentioned. It actually just came live this morning, so those interested in seeing a little bit of detail about Canada's sponsorship program and also some suggestions on how various things to consider for countries and community actors thinking about their own are welcome to check that resource out at refugeesponsorship.org. I'd like to switch now to speak with Laura a little bit about the Radcliffe Foundation's interest in this work. And I know, Laura, that both yourself and the Radcliffe's founder, Frank Giustra, have seen firsthand the refugee crisis, and that you've also been really actively engaging and talking to other private sector colleagues about that crisis and talking to them about how they might get involved. So I'm wondering, at a time when I think many of us would like to see the private sector take on a bigger role in solving some of these challenges, how do you talk to actors in the business world about refugee-related issues?
So as Jennifer said, we've both been to the front lines many times, and Frank Giustra, the founder of the foundation, a businessman in Canada, first went to Lesvos November 2015, when it was really the height of the crisis and the boats coming across, and he saw it for his own eyes. And he couldn't believe it. It was, he reads the news, he's up on current events, but when you see it for your own eyes, it brings that emotion, it brings so many different feelings, and he immediately said, what can I do to help? And so he went home back to Canada, Vancouver, Canada, and he told as many people that would listen to him. He then said, I want to bring you there, because his approach was show and tell. Because a lot of the people were, getting their information from the media, and it might be accurate, might not, but to actually see it for your own eyes. So he's made a number of trips with business colleagues in Canada and the US to Lesvos, Greece, and the areas to see the front lines, unfiltered, we call them the unfiltered tours. And people immediately say, what can I do to help? I had no idea it was this, this bad. These people are, the lack of dignity, they're fleeing their homes with their kids with a knapsack on their back. And so that really engaged the business community to, Frank calls it the hand wallet reflex. And so it is donating money, but I know that there's other things the business community can do, but it's really going to see it firsthand, and that was his approach to engaging the business community, and it's worked.
Great, thank you, thanks. We're going to come back to you and get more information about other things that business leaders might be able to do and how we can engage the private sector in this work. First, I'd like to turn to you, Sean. Many of us on this stage have the pleasure of working with your colleague, Gregory Maniatis, who brings incredible vision and leadership to the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. You're, of course, leading another really important initiative, and Patrick mentioned it off the top, this incredible investment Mr. Soros made, a commitment to invest up to $500 million in private sector business innovations that can help migrants and refugees. And we'd love to hear a little bit more from you on how that work is going, what the objectives are, and where we're at 1 year after the announcement.
That's a pleasure. Thank you. Yes, as Sue said, last year here in Concordia was a very special moment, and actually in the few days after that, the White House announced, I think, $650 million overall of commitments that have been made by the private sector. I think on the press release they said it was from 51 companies from across the American economy, representing more than 2.5 million employees, more than $775 billion in annual revenue, and more than 3.2 trillion in market capitalization. So really the sort of might of the American economy targeting a sort of global world issue. But setting aside George Soros's commitment, these businesses were committing $150 million. So about 0.0002 of those revenues. And I think that's why George made the commitment of the scale that he did. He hoped that it would catalyze others to understand the scale of the issue, to understand the scale of the required response. So our job in the last year has been to put that money to work. We had relatively few restrictions. We had a global remit. We could look at debt, equity, early stage, growth capital. We could look at blended finance, impact bonds. And I think we hoped and somewhat expected, in fact, that we would be deluged with opportunities. We would be overwhelmed with response. And we haven't been, frankly. I think we've had to work far harder than we thought to find businesses that are really responding in a sustainable and credible way to this. Who are wanting to serve this extraordinary, this massive community of dispossessed people who remain largely invisible to markets. And we've reflected on it, and knowing that you were asked this question, and I think there are maybe three barriers that we see that I would encourage people and the things that I talk to when I meet with those in the private sector to sort of think about. The first is really a shift in perspective. If substantive business responses are going to be developed, then we have to move from seeing it as a short-term refugee crisis to a long-term macro trend, a trend of global migration. Short-term crises invite sort of acts of corporate kindness. But long-term trends are things against which businesses make significant commitments. They're things against which people commit investment and resources and creativity and innovation. And it's in that space that investable opportunities emerge. The second, and I think almost all the other panelists have touched on this in some way, is, to borrow a phrase from Brian Stevenson, a shift in proximity. Those of us with economic power in the private sector are frankly just too far removed from the problem, from the human realities of refugees. Smart money really only invests in well-understood contexts on the basis of intimate local knowledge. And we just have to, as individuals and as leaders of businesses, get ourselves closer to the human realities of the problem. There's lots of business interest, but there's few who are close enough to know what to do. And I think that the example that you made of Frank's experience, the references to the impact of the sponsorship and the way in which it's touched people in the UK and in Canada are evidence of just that sort of proximity being transformative. The final one, I think, is a shift in paradigm. Do we see refugees and migrants as a threat or an opportunity? And can we at least acknowledge that they could be both? We have thought a lot about this year, and seeing refugees not as passive victims or beneficiaries of assistance, but seeing them as entrepreneurs, seeing them as employees, and seeing them ultimately as informed consumers of goods and services. Now, as entrepreneurs, they're disproportionately successful over time in history. And so we've been investing in platforms that get SME funding to refugee entrepreneurs in all of the complexities and the particularities of their circumstances. And we've been doing that initially in Jordan and the frontline states. As employees, refugees are a vital source of skilled and non-skilled labor, and we're making investments in supporting job creation and grant making in terms of supporting labor market integration and job matching platforms. And finally, as consumers, refugees and migrants represent a market. They represent a market for goods and services that are tailored to their needs, that are priced appropriately, with companies that are prepared to serve them in ways that ensure their dignity. And we are really actively looking for financial, health, education services, businesses that can deliver products and services to those markets. So I think if we can reframe this in terms of seeing this as a long-term macro trend, getting close to these populations, and seeing this as a real economic opportunity, then there's a role for the private sector to do meaningful, sustainable, long-term contributions.
You see many of us nodding our heads here. I think we probably all have examples of entrepreneurial successes, amazing contributions we see refugees making, and agree with you. You're right that part of it is a shift in the frame, the paradigm in which we think about this problem, and that's something really important that the private sector can help us all do, to really think in a different way about the people and the challenges, but also critically the opportunities that displacement represents. High Commissioner, I'd like to come back to you, if I may. On this question of other examples, we've talked a little bit about sponsorship. We've heard from both yourself and the Minister about why sponsorship is something that can very powerfully mobilize communities and bring people together. You must see other examples. I'd be interested in hearing from you if there's other ways that you see grassroots support for refugees manifesting itself, and if you have thoughts or things you're excited about in terms of how that support can be mobilized in a context, again, where we're looking for more resettlement capacity.
I hope everybody realizes, because I think we need to be realistic, that the refugee issue, and more broadly speaking, the issue of people on the move, is an issue that generates much hostility. And this hostility, this fear, this apprehension is fueled by unscrupulous politicians, multiplies, and translates itself into rejection many times. I'm not just talking about the global north, the industrialized country, although that's very present there, but also around in other countries. Remember, 86% of the refugees are not in rich countries, are in poor or middle-income countries. And there, the burden is much bigger. The resources are much less. And this hostile context has an easy terrain to grow. So I think that on the other hand, what we have seen as a first reaction to big refugee movements is also a surge in solidarity. You know, in the last couple of weeks, since refugees have started pouring from Myanmar, Rohingya refugees, into Bangladesh, we've been raising through our channel from the general public, small donations, $10, $5. We've raised almost $6 million already in a few days, literally. So there is a lot of solidarity. I always tell politicians, why we always try to mobilize the negatives? There's a huge solidarity constituency there that is also very powerful. I'm not saying this to my friend Ahmed Hussein. They know this very well, and that's what they're doing. But in many other countries, this doesn't happen. And I think that these initiatives, because we're talking here about two different ones. One is the Global Resettlement Initiative. The other one is George Soros' commendable pledge of $500 million to really leverage the entrepreneurship of refugees. These initiatives are precious in that sense because they provide frames, organized frames, to that solidarity. Because otherwise, that solidarity, once the internet and the TVs and the media stop talking about these disasters, and very often this happens, this solidarity melts or moves to another situation. I hope that this initiative can can stabilize that solidarity coming from the private sector, but by from the private sector irradiating somehow in the local communities, and can become and make it more sustainable. I think that is very important because, and this is my last point, don't forget another important information. Refugee crises are not short-lived, as was mentioned. We calculate, although this is a bit of a, it's not that scientific, but it gives an indication. We calculate that the average years of displacement are between 15 and 20. This is a generation. And this is where we really need to think in a new way about investing in education of these people and in employment. These are the two key pieces. So this is why I think these initiatives are so important.
Thank you. I think your comment that this is about organizing or providing a frame for solidarity is very helpful as we think about how we can capitalize on the compassion that does exist in individual communities, how we can try to ensure that that plays a bigger role in our overall response to what's happening. And Minister, I'd like to take you along a similar path and ask you, as you think about this partnership, which brings your government together with very different actors in this quest to provide a frame, some sort of structure for that compassion in other countries around the world. What is your experience of working with these kind of multi-partner stakeholders, and do you see it being effective in trying to mobilize the kind of individual community level response that the High Commissioner is talking about?
Absolutely. I think I just want to say that in principle, Canadians individually are not any more generous or less generous than Americans or Germans or anything or any other person. But our response to the Syrian refugee crisis was unique because that generosity, as the High Commissioner has said, had an official channel to do something about. When American citizens were watching those harrowing images of Syria and the refugees coming out of that country, they had the same reactions as Canadians, of feeling sympathy, or feeling that what can I do, and so on. But as a Canadian, you have an opportunity where you can get together with 4 other Canadians and sponsor a refugee family under a system called Group of 5 sponsorship. Literally, 5 ordinary Canadians can sponsor a refugee family. An organization can do the same thing. We had school children organizing bake sales to sponsor a refugee family. We had senior citizens organizing money to sponsor refugees. That outlet simply didn't exist in the United States in terms of private sponsorship, but the feelings were there. So I really agree completely with what you're saying in terms of having that outlet. The second piece is constantly fighting to, I think part of this is leadership. The leadership is what differentiates between emphasizing and looking at refugees as a security issue or as a humanitarian issue. And it takes leadership to say, we can do both. We can both protect Canadians and provide a humanitarian response. The previous government to us didn't do that. They overemphasized the security issue and said, we can't take too many Syrian refugees because there's a security issue. We came into office saying, no, we can do that. We can have a response that makes sure that we process everyone and make sure that every single refugee that we bring into Canada goes through security screening and health screening and all that stuff, while at the same time being ambitious in terms of increasing the numbers. Because it's not fair that Jordan, a country of 9 million, takes in 1.2 million Syrian refugees, and Canada doesn't increase its numbers. So that's why last year we felt that we should do our part. Turkey has taken in 3.5 million Syrian refugees. And so these are countries that are not as wealthy as Canada. And so, it's not a question of patting ourselves in the back. It's a question of trying as much as possible, to the extent that we can, to do our part in the global atmosphere. But part of the key in that messaging is also to highlight the incredible successes of refugees. There's a Syrian refugee family that was picked up, processed by the Canadian immigration system, and they were resettled in eastern Canada in the province of Nova Scotia. They were chocolatiers back in Syria. They reopened their business. In the first year, they had a factory employing many, many Canadians. This year, just I think a week ago, they opened a second factory. This is a refugee family that arrived in Canada about a year ago. You have countless number of refugees who are making amazing contributions back to society. You have other immigrants who came to Canada with virtually nothing, who are private sector people who are giving back. I told you about Mr. Mohammed Faki. He owns a restaurant chain, and he's hired 100 Syrian refugees because he felt that if he didn't do that, it would be hard for them to get that first job. So he was willing to have some of them fail, because he said that's part of the process. So have 100 Syrian refugees hired. He hired an HR consultant to kind of train them. And that would be the first job that they would have, and then they could then use that experience to get another job. We've had many, many other private sector folks donating money, services, in-kind support. CN Rail provided rent supplements for 1 year to all the refugees that we brought last year. So there's many ways for the private sector to showcase the best of the refugee contribution, but part of it is to showcase the businesses that are started by refugees themselves. Australia has a great example of that, which is something that I've been very interested in. They have a refugee entrepreneurship program where the government brings in seed money, expertise, help with incorporation of companies, and actually assists refugees to launch businesses. And it's a very successful program. And it's, again, looking at refugees as agents of change, people who have diversity, who can contribute, and not just recipients of aid.
I think one of the amazing things about Canada is the media telling all of these stories. So we all read with such interest and I think a real sense of pride, stories about the chocolate factories and the other many, many examples of both entrepreneurial initiatives by refugees themselves and the ways that Canadian communities are assisting. Which brings me, Laura, to you. I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to ask you for a brief response, and then High Commissioner, to you for a last word. Laura, I'm interested, aside from media, aside from telling stories, what are some other ways that the private sector can make concrete contributions to the challenges we're facing in this space?
More than just writing checks. Strategic problem solving, bring efficiencies to problem solving to reduce costs. That's, I know, what we're applying. We call it entrepreneurial philanthropy. So a business lens to a problem, and how can you solve that problem? I think the business community can pivot maybe a little quicker than some of the other larger organizations, and respond quicker. And we can also do in-kind donations, and we see lots of corporations around the world that are, what they have, they are doing in-kind donations, which makes a world of difference, and innovation to the problems that we're seeing and facing us.
Great, thank you. High Commissioner, you began our session by outlining the scope of the challenges and putting, I think, our conversation in a context. I'd like to come back to that larger context to close and just get your final reflections on how public-private partnerships can be deemed successful. What are the metrics of success when we look at these new initiatives? We're trying to bring together different actors. For you, how will we know if we're succeeding in diversifying the space?
Well, success means measuring the quality and the impact of these inputs in the lives of the refugees. And of course, and here I'm talking about refugees mostly in the places where they are, in the ability of these refugees to be included in the communities that host them. This is a very difficult piece that we're struggling with at the moment with this long, protracted refugee situation. You know, my concluding word would be looking at the future. In a year's time, hopefully, we'll be here in New York about to discuss, to have the final round of political discussions around the global compact on refugees that I mentioned. My ambition would be, and perhaps we could do it here at Concordia, to come here to have a discussion on lessons learned during these 2 years, from the launch of these initiatives last year to the Global Compact, and to show that the private sector partnership with public institutions can have very concrete and positive results in transforming, as you all said, the perception, the reality of refugees being a burden or being a charity issue or a humanitarian issue also, to really transforming this image into refugees as contributors to their own communities and society, both resettled refugees in places like Canada or New Zealand or Argentina, the members of this initiative, but also refugees that benefit from funds like George Soros Fund for developing their ability to establish business and to be self-reliant. I think that if we could be back here with concrete examples, real stories, that would be such a powerful argument in support of the establishment of the Global Compact. States will listen to this experience, and our own effort to promote the notion that refugees are a global responsibility, global geographically, but globally across societies, I think that effort will be greatly supported. So I propose that we do that in a year's time. Thank you.
I hope you're listening, Nick and Matt. I think we've got your 4th, 5th, and 6th plenary sessions that you'll be adding on next year. I'd like to thank very much everyone for joining me here. Thanks to Concordia for having us, and enjoy your next few days together. Thank you again to each of the panelists.